Now we're on to the second session, which is Feminism's Unfinished Business.
Right, well, how many of you here are feminists? 1, 2, 3, half.
I have.
Yeah, good, okay. I mean,
what it means.
yeah, I would say. The half, and I'm not sure, right, is not least to do with, again, definitions. What is a feminist?
Does feminism mean you like women?
Feminism
No.
means you like women. No, I don't think that's
No, that's
feminism.
not the definition? Okay. Then I'm not a feminist.
So feminism, it's gone through many stages. Let's just pick that up. The first time the word was used by a French philosopher in about 1840 or so. But of course there were already feminist thoughts before that, not least the rights of women and so on, written at the time of the French Revolution in 1789. But I suppose the first time most people will have become conscious of feminism as an ism, as a movement, will have been with the suffragettes and women's suffrage at the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century. So that was a first step in feminism, which was about political rights, women having political rights. The second phase, the second wave of feminism was in the 1960s, probably triggered by Betty Friedan's book, The Feminine Mystique, but there were other books around at the same time, Simone de Beauvoir's The Second Sex, and so on and so forth. A little later on, what's her name's gone now, the Female Eunuch, Germaine Greer, the Female Eunuch. Books coming out at that time which were not so much about political equality, because women then did have the vote and were able to stand for parliament and those kinds of things, but were more about some kinds of social equality, being accepted as equal human beings, let's say. And perhaps some of us have forgotten that in the 1960s and even into the 1970s, a woman could not, even if she was the breadwinner and had earned all the money, could not get a mortgage without her husband's permission, right? It's just one example which I think to today's ears sounds so outlandish. Like, how could that be? And yet it was considered entirely reasonable and normal back then. So that was the second wave of feminism. The third wave of feminism is probably currently going on, and yet nobody's too clear exactly what it is. So we do have a bit of a problem with defining feminism in the contemporary environment, and we'll come to that in a moment. But I think the thing that has most damaged feminism is this unrepressible lie, actually, about bra-burning feminists, right? Bra-burning, men-hating feminists. This emerged in the late 60s, a group of feminists in America had a demonstration, and in this demonstration they burnt their bras. It happened once, right? It was just kind of shock people. We're breaking out, we're being free, we're not putting up with this kind of nonsense again. They burnt their bras. It became such a popular meme for the media that all feminists thereafter became associated with this. And there was a radical feminist position in the 60s, 70s and 80s, which was, let's be blunt, man-hating. That is, feminists wanted to live that. These radical feminists, there were only ever a small minority of the full spectrum of feminists, but this small minority wanted to assert that women could live perfectly well without men. They did not want men around. Men were toxic and destructive and damaging and repressive, and therefore we should be shot of men as far as we possibly could be. And these were women who wanted to live in women's only communes, who wanted to bring up their children without men around to damage their development, and so on and so forth. But that was only ever a small subset, an extreme wing, let's say, of feminism. Having said that, of course, more recently, and this is where we come into the third wave, and what does the third wave consist of, we've seen the Me Too movement, which has started to expose that actually there are a lot of men who are very damaging, and that there are women in work environments and social environments who are severely oppressed and limited and find ordinary life, difficult because of the men around them, right? And therefore there appears to be a little more justification for that argument. We're now becoming more honest about the extent, for example, of domestic violence. Now, we know there is some domestic violence of women against men, but by far the majority of it is men against women. We know that there's an awful lot of pinching of bums on tubes and stuff that women have mostly kind of learnt over time to go, oh, well, it's just how it goes, you just got to put up with it or something. And there's a generation now of young women who go, I'm not putting up with that, it's not acceptable. And so there appears to be a certain element of justification for that very radical anger that was expressed by some feminists back in the 60s, and we didn't rate it. We go, that's just nonsense, you're going over the top. When you stop and think about it, maybe they weren't. Maybe they were, as it were, angry before their time. Right? We've all been familiar with the casting couch, which finally became exposed and refused with the Me Too movement and the Harvey Weinstein and Weinstein, was it? Yeah, Weinstein case. And then we discovered that he wasn't alone and there were lots of other things. So there's all of that. So feminism in a general way, if we can sort of sum it up more or less, is simply saying that women ought to be able to live an equally facilitated and unproblematic life as men do too. They should not have to worry about any of the things that men don't worry about, and they should be able to do all of the things that men do. Now, that doesn't mean to say that men have entirely unproblematic lives. Of course, they also have their challenges and pressures and so on. And in some ways, feminists, a good, open, third-wave feminist, will be concerned about men and their lives as well, because they recognise that the constraints and pressures on men frequently are the kind of mirror image of the constraints and pressures on women too. If men are spending all their time worrying about being macho or having to show how strong they are or not showing their emotions, all of those things, that's damaging to both men and women. It's damaging to the way in which children are brought up. It's damaging to the way in which boys grow up, and so on. If they're having to do all this, swilling beer and nudging each other every time a woman walks past, right? If that's what they're having to do, even though they don't necessarily want to do it, but they'll be mocked by their male peers if they don't, right? That's doing damage to women as well as to men. So a good third-wave feminist recognises that. Furthermore, contemporary feminists recognise what's called intersectionality. Now, intersectionality is a recognition that there are a whole range of aspects of oneself which can impinge on each other, and some people carry several of the factors that lead to discrimination or oppression. So you think about a black single mother who has spent time in prison, let's say, right? This woman is carrying so many contemporary social disadvantages that her capacity to kind of get out from under and get on is far greater than a white, affluent, married woman who's never been in trouble with the police or whatever it might be, educated and so forth, right? And therefore, when we're trying to understand the disadvantages of people and we're trying to argue for a level of equality, we've got to take into account that this woman is never going to find equality until we don't only address the fact that she's black and the fact that she's a woman, but the fact she's been to prison and the fact that she's a single mother, and our society is not making it possible on any of those fronts to kind of assert herself and emerge. Now, some people resist this kind of talk because they want to say, well, everybody can sort themselves out and pull themselves up by their bootstraps and work out, and look at me anyway, I didn't find that difficult. But this look at me stuff is a really dangerous instinct, because, let's hope, thank God, that we are broadly successful in managing, right? I've often said this when I'm involved in teacher training, right? There am I dealing with a bunch of people who are teachers or want to be teachers, and they are almost by definition incapable of understanding people who are failing at school. Because all of these teachers, by definition, are people who've made it through the system. Right? So unless they capture a memory of the people who disappeared from their horizon, probably not in their social group, probably that they were quite contemptuous of at school, probably who left early and they can't even quite remember their names, how is that teacher ever going to be able to teach the child who's finding it difficult at school? Because their understanding is how it works, how it goes well. And for many of us, I think our instinct to say, oh, come on, I could do that, or I can't, our inability to understand those who are finding it really difficult makes it easy for us to dismiss movements that want to listen to those people. Right? So what are the unfinished things of feminism? Because we might say, well, come on, we've just had a second female prime minister. Let's set aside how long she lasted. Right? We've just had a second female prime minister. There's female heads of state all over the place. There's, half the members of parliament in Norway are women. What's your problem here? Women can do whatever they like. It's not a problem. Right? But in actual fact, we know about levels of domestic violence against women. We know that's true. We know that girls and women are around the world deeply disadvantaged educationally. We know that there are many families still in the world who, if they can only afford to give an education to one child, they'll give it to the son, not the daughter. We know that many girls are disadvantaged in processes of marriage and so forth. We know that society makes it exceptionally difficult for women to have and keep and look after children if they need to be able to try and earn a living as well. Right? We know all those things. Those are true. And they exist in our society. I'm not even talking about the extremes of things like what to my mind is erroneously called honour killings. I call them shame killings. They're not about honour at all. But, we know about those things too. But we can immediately look at stuff that is well recognised. The pay gap, for example. Still haven't resolved the pay gap. Right? Women are more poorly paid than men. And it's only comparatively recently that women earned the same as men for the same job. Right? So women were paid less anyway, but add to that, for example, if women are, and they usually do, have to step out the way a bit as they climb the career ladder if they want to have children. So even if they go back to work pretty quickly and so on, they just find it more difficult to make themselves available to the requirements of the job if they want to become a head of department or take on a managerial role or something. So they hang back or they're disadvantaged. And indeed, people at interview, right, are still asked, are you thinking of having children or whatever it might be?
It's illegal. It's illegal to ask that.
It is illegal, but they're still asked. And what are you supposed to do? Complain or try and get the job? Right? So, we know what's illegal, but we also know that it goes on. And the woman asked that question is constrained if she doesn't get the promotion Does she complain so she can't apply for the next promotion and get a reputation, and then she wants to get a reference for her next job and people are going to say she's a troublemaker? Or does she keep her head down and carry on? Or what does she do? Right? These are things which continue to be issues for women. So there is certainly there's the pay gap. There's violence against women and girls. There's reduced educational opportunities for women in all kinds of contexts. There's dreadful childcare arrangements and expensive, which mostly it's women who are constrained by. Now, of course, we all know of that lovely husband or boyfriend or whatever who shares and is equal and does all that stuff, and he cooks too, and does the ironing, and everybody thinks he's just an amazing hero because he cooks too. Nobody says she's an amazing hero because she cooks too, right? So even when there are men playing an equal part, they get more applause for playing an equal part in the domestic realities. So when I talk about feminism's unfinished business, all of this is still yet to be resolved, and it is still constraining. Add to that things like fashion and beauty issues, where women continue to be much more under pressure and constrained and judged on things like their appearance. Many people have commented on the fact that, when a female prime minister stands up, you get a description of what she's wearing and so on. The male prime minister stands up, nobody knows or cares or notices. The Queen never went out without somebody remarking on the colour of her dress, right? Has anybody yet said anything about Prince Charles's suit? I don't think so. Or King Charles, should I say? Those kinds of things. So therefore, presumably, right, whenever the Queen was going to go out, she had to stop and think pretty hard, and I can't wear that dress, and I wore that last week, and have I got a new thing, and and where am I going, and which shoes should I, all of that stuff, and Charles just sticks on a suit and off he goes, right? Those things, let alone the makeup and the hair and all the rest of that stuff. And women are constrained in those things in a way in which men mostly are not. Now, I'm not trying to suggest that women in affluent Western society are kind of incredibly crushed, because it's clearly mostly not the case. Sometimes it is, but mostly not the case. But nevertheless, there are still inequalities that shouldn't have to exist. Some of you will know the principle or the idea of the male gaze, that women are nearly always conscious of being subject to, especially if they're making a public presentation of themselves. I'm not talking about just going down to the shops or something, but if you're going to make a public presentation of yourself, the male gaze. That is, to some extent, you have to assess, how am I going to be considered by the men in the room, right? And that becomes a constraint. And I think all of us are familiar, for example, with turning up to that barbecue or Sunday morning party or whatever, and there are all the women who have made a real effort to look decent, and the blokes come in their tracksuit bottoms and t-shirts because I just want to be comfortable, right? There's that inequality that still exists there. So feminism still has this unfinished business about this inequality. Add to that now the new and modern issue, which is, anyway, what constitutes a sex and a gender. There's much dispute about whether we are still living in the binary world of men and women. Probably all of you are familiar now with signing up to something or other, and just trying to get the internet when you go to Brent Cross or something, right? And you've got to fill in this form, you put your name, and it says gender, male, female, other, rather not say, what's all that about, right? What constitutes a gender and what should be accommodated in our society, contemporary feminism is getting to grips with that thing. Now, you probably all familiar with the things like the J.K. Rowling thing, where she made strong statements, as did Germaine Greer, about what constitutes a woman and not a woman, and others saying that this was transphobic against transgender people, hating them. Almost certainly not that. Might be lacking imagination, but probably not hating them. And all the disputes about whether people who've been through a sex change operation from male to female can compete in women's sports, or do they have an unfair advantage because they've grown up with the muscle mass of a man, and all of that stuff, right? These are all battles at the cutting edge of this issue. Before I open this up both to questions and to comments, because you probably have your own opinions, let me just say something Jewish. The first thing to say is that the Talmud readily recognizes half a dozen genders. Right? That's kind of important to say. You don't tend to get told this by rabbis, but it is there. Right? The Talmud discusses, when I say half a dozen genders, of course the Talmud doesn't express it like that. But the Talmud discusses people who are of what the Talmud would call indeterminate gender. Androgynous people who are both male and female. Or hermaphrodites, for example. Or people who are neither male nor female. Now, we didn't know this before, that a proportion of babies, or perhaps you do know this because maybe you had such a baby, I don't know, right? But most of us, I think, don't experience this, that a proportion of babies are born with indeterminate genitalia. And the doctors or nurses have kind of looked at the baby and go, well, I reckon it's more male than female. I reckon it's more female than male. And they go, right, it's a girl, call her Priscilla, right, whatever. And they've got no foundation for that. They just kind of make a guess. And when this poor Priscilla starts to approach puberty, they go, I'm not a girl. Right? What are they supposed to do then? So we know from the days of April Ashley, back in the 60s and 70s, that there are people, and what's the name of the chap who climbed Everest with, and then became a female travel writer? I can't remember the name.
Jan Morrison.
Jan Morris.
Yes.
Yeah, who was John Morris and became Jan Morris. These folk have always existed, right? But we've largely go, well, that's very odd, I don't know what to do with that. And we haven't tried to create a theory out of it. But now we know there are more such people than we have been led to believe. And they're supposed to go around slinking about, embarrassed by themselves, right? Now we think, wait a minute, why are we doing that to them? So there's a lot which is complicated. Now the rabbis, of course, discuss. If you've got a person who's half male, half female, who's got a penis and breasts or whatever, do you count them for minion or don't you? These are real issues, right? Do they have to sit downstairs or upstairs? What do you do? Now, of course, Jewish thought in its classical form is very binary in all sorts of ways. Halakha likes binary clarity. Is it alive or is it dead? I'm not doing with half dead. I want to know, where is it? What is it? Right? Is it milk or is it meat? All right, I know there's parif, but otherwise, what's going on here? Right? Is it Shabbat or is it weekday? When does Shabbat start? It doesn't start in the evening. It starts at 4:27. Thank you. Get on. Right? We like that clarity, binary clarity. Is it Pesach or is it not Pesach? Is this Chametz or is it not Chametz? So that's right. Is it male or is it female? That's how we do it. But of course, it's not that easy. Now, what do we do with this? What do we do with the transgender person who comes into shul and sits downstairs, to all intents and purposes, seems male, right? Except somebody says, I'm sure that was Susan 5 years ago, right? But do you count him, her, for minion or not? Are they allowed to just kind of self-define? That's the current preference, right? So they come into shul and they go, well, I'm a man, so in that case, I'll count you. What if they come into shul next week and go, and I've changed my mind, actually, I'm going to be a woman? And you go, oh, we won't count you. But what if they want to be a woman and sit downstairs and be counted? Right? So we do have this difficulty. Now, Jewish thought in its classical form, and remember, Orthodox Judaism, and that, of course, I make it sound like it's a single thing, and it isn't. It's a whole spectrum of stuff. But Orthodox Judaism is classical in its preferences, in its outlook. It's not modern in its outlook, by which I mean this. The modern privileges the individual. The classical privileges the group. Now, it's always going to create tensions, because sometimes the individual matters more than the group, and sometimes the group matters more than the individual. The modern world depresses the group. It's not interested in that. It's all about the sovereign self, the individual. I have the right to choose. Right? And the classical says, no. The group needs attention. You must subvert yourself to the group. As I guess most of us would say, well, yeah, but the truth is somewhere in between, isn't it? Right? And all the time we're having to try to make accommodations. But when we come to the business of men and women, male and female, the classical Jewish position, the halachic position says, society needs men and women, families need men and women, and each gender needs to be clear about its primary responsibility. Primary responsibility. The halakha says the primary responsibility of the man is the community. The primary responsibility of the woman is the family. This means to say that the chief rabbi of the universe, right, living with his wife, he looks at the chicken she's cooking and he says, I don't know that looks kosher. And she says, it's kosher. And he said, well, I'm not sure. I mean, I am the world's halakhic expert on chickens. And she says, I'm sorry, it's kosher. It's kosher. If she says it's kosher in the house, it's kosher. If he was so much of a boor as to grab her by the hair and drag her outside the garden gate and say, I said it's treif, then it's treif, because now we're outside. In the house, she defines. Right? That's why the rabbis say about Abraham and Sarah, if your wife is short, bend down to listen. Okay? You've got to pay attention to your wife. That's the classic halachic model. And that's why we have minyan and not minyan and so on. The men have the responsibility to keep the community going. The women have the responsibility to keep the family going. Now that immediately makes women and some men go, yeah, but why should they have to do all the nappies and the washing and the stuff, you know? I didn't say anything about nappies and washing. I said family. If anything, if the woman wants to be playing with the children or educating them in good qualities and standards, let the man do the washing and the washing up and the whatever it is, because that's nothing to do with the family. That's managing the domestic chores. But we've fallen into the trap of thinking that family is synonymous with domestic chores. It isn't. Developing a family is about developing a family. Domestic chores are a different thing. Come to that, if the woman wants to say, I want to be a brain surgeon, so I'm going to arrange for a nanny to look after the children, good luck to her. She doesn't have to be stuck at home all day long, but she is responsible for the family. She can't say, well, I don't see why I have to arrange the nanny, let him arrange the nanny. She could say to her husband, would you arrange the nanny? And he goes, sure, no problem, job done. But she's responsible. That's an interesting arrangement. The same thing goes, the man says, I don't want to work really, I'd much rather stay at home and because I quite like gardening. You go out to work. Right? And she says, oh, I don't mind that. Fair enough. But he's had to make the arrangement. If she says, well, I don't want to go out to work, then he's going to have to go out and earn a living because he's responsible for that aspect of things. It's not that you each have to do the thing, but you're each responsible for ensuring that it's done. Now, we can easily imagine a modern family in which neither parent wants the responsibility of the children to be theirs. And each says, I don't see why I have to arrange it. Oh, why can't he? Why can't she? Right? And they pass it back and forth between them. Right? Halachically, that would be unacceptable. But it's not unacceptable for the woman to spend all her time out at work and the man to spend all his time at home. And of course, in many Haredi families, as you know, the woman is the breadwinner and the man spends his time partly in study and also with the children. You go to Stamford Hill or something and you see any number of men pushing buggies and going shopping and stuff because the woman's earning a living. Well, that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. But it's about who's responsible. Now that's a classical model because we're not going to say, are you fulfilled or not fulfilled? Okay, what does the family need? It needs somebody to do this and it needs somebody to do that. Now step up and do it. Don't give me all that nonsense about personal fulfillment. So here we come to a wonderful classic feature which is not part of modernity at all, which is the indifference to human happiness. Don't give me all this stuff about being happy. Do your job. Now that is very non-modern, but very classical. Do your job. If you do your job well, you will probably be contented. But happy? What's that about? I remember when I was head of a school many years ago now, nearly 30 years ago. I was a baby head. I was head of the school there, and we were doing a careers thing or something, I can't remember, and I said to one parent, but what is it you want for your child? They said, well, so long as they're happy. I said, well, in that case, let them smoke dope. It's the quickest way I know, right? We just want to be happy. Smoke dope, what's your problem? Right? They thought that was an appalling thing for a head teacher to say. Right? That ought not to be the goal of a parent for their child. Right? The goal of a parent for their child is that they should be useful, make a difference, especially a Jewish child. Right? Useful, make a difference. Happy is a byproduct. If you happen to get it, good luck to you. If you don't, still make a difference. Be happy. Now, this is non-modern talk. All right? So when we come to feminism, a lot of feminism is about personal fulfillment. But a lot of feminism is about a fair society. That fair society narrative is absolutely Jewish. There's nothing Jewish that says that there's a pecking order between men and women. Right? Now, some of you may be familiar that in Shachrit, in the morning service, there is a list of brachot, blessings. And most of these are equal for men and women, although, of course, men have to say them and women don't in halakha, right? Women can if they choose, but they don't have to. But there is one bracha, at least, which is entirely different as between men and women. Many people will tell you that the bracha for men is, thank God for not making me a woman. That's not what the bracha says. It says, you are blessed, O Lord our God, who has not made me a woman. Now just remember, a bracha is not an act of thanksgiving. It's an act of recognition. A bracha is noting what is. Now, of course, if you're looking at that apple and saying, you are blessed God who's created the fruit of the tree, it's not only an act of recognition, it's most probably an act of gratitude as well, because you're going to eat the apple and that's nice. But when you hear bad news, and you say the bracha on bad news, right? You are blessed God who is a true judge. You're not expressing gratitude, you're expressing acceptance. You are also responsible for this. So when you say you are blessed, O Lord our God, King of the universe, who has not made me a woman, are you expressing gratitude or acceptance? Well, you pays your money, takes your choice. It's up to you to decide to read it whichever way you like. Until you look at the bracha that women are given to say instead. Women, and notice, it doesn't say, "You are blessed, O Lord our God, King of the universe, who has made me a man." It's just, "who has not made me a woman." So it's already a little more complex than mere gratitude, right? But women have, "You are blessed, O Lord our God, King of the universe, who has made me according to your will." What does that mean? Does that mean, "Oh, well, that's what you wanted, I'm stuck with it"? Or does it mean, "I am exactly how you want me"? Well, you pays your money, you takes your choice. It is definitely a more positive bracha than "who has not made me a woman." It's made me just the way you want me. That's quite powerful, I think. For quite a long time, embarrassed as I was by the male bracha, I used to say the women's bracha. Because I thought that's true for men as much as for women, right? "Who's made me according to your will." And then I decided, I'm not sure about that. All I know is that God didn't make me a woman. Now, we all know, don't we, scientifically, that every human embryo starts off female and some become male. So the default position is female, and some men turn out not to be women. Right? That's the science of it. Does the bracha reflect that or not? I don't know. But there's nothing in halakha that says women are more or less important than men, or the other way around, right? Unless it's possibly true that women are more important than men. How do we know that? From circumcision, right? If you think about the sign of the covenant, Brit Milah, this is how we are going to identify Jews. Now, if you were going to choose how to identify Jews by marking the body in some way, what would you choose? Right? What would you choose? Now, this is clearly a male choice. Right? There's no way women can go, "Well, I think I'll do that too." There's no way. So if the sign of the covenant had been that all men should remove the top joint of their little finger or something, you could have a progressive Jewish position which goes, "Well, I think women should do that too," right? Like wearing a kippah or something, or women wearing a talit. Women can do that as well, right? So we're going to do women and men equal rights, so women do this. But no, it's absolutely categorically, we are going to do something that women cannot do. Now, is this clever or is it not clever? Is this a wonderful thing for men or what? Now, again, if you're going to have a sign, would you not want a sign which is a bit visible? Right? This is the most private sign of all. I'm going to choose a bit of the body that nobody ever sees, and I'm going to put the sign there. How strange is that? So what do we know about men and their penises? Now, some of you are familiar with the expression willy waving. Right? This is men showing off. Willy waving. Right? So I'm trying to be big and grand and wonderful, and aren't I amazing? Right? Now, circumcision is literally cutting men down to size. What does it say when you say to men, "I'm going to take the thing that you think is most amazing about you, and I'm going to insist that you mark it so you don't forget"? Women, don't you worry about that. You don't need it. Think about that. Think about tefillin. Men are supposed to put on tefillin, women are not. You'll find any number of rabbis who will tell you what a tremendous privilege it is to put on tefillin. It is a crown and a thing. I don't know how many of you put on tefillin. It's not a privilege, it's a drag. You've got to do it every morning, right? You get day off for Shabbat because it's Shabbat. But otherwise, it's a thing. It's a duty, it's a chore. It's like shaving, right? It's just one of those things you have to do, unless you choose not to. Right, so tefillin. What is tefillin? Is it a privilege? Is it a beauty? Is it a crown? Is it a thing? Or is it literally strapping yourself to Torah every morning. Why do men have to tie themselves down and women don't? Because we don't care about women? They're not important? We don't expect anything of them? Or because women don't need to tie themselves down and men do? All the evidence is there that if there is an inequality, it's men who are not trusted, men who are not rated, men who are required to keep reminding themselves that there's a God and they've got responsibilities, and women are not given that. Is that because we don't care about women? Women who give the Jewish status to their children, women who are supposed to preserve and maintain the family and the home, which is the primary centre of Jewish life, the community, compared to the home. And yet we've fallen for the thing, haven't we? We've all fallen for it. Men are great, men are in charge, men are leaders, and women are going, why can't I wear tefillin? God, please. So there's a feminist thing there. There's unfinished business. Modern Orthodox Judaism is still struggling with the thing within the Jewish world. You'll all know that there are now a few Jewish women, Orthodox women, who have smicha, who have rabbinic ordination. It is almost certainly a matter of less than one generation before we have Orthodox women in our pulpits. 10 years, 15 years, it'll be there. It's coming. Remember, 20 years ago, was it, or so, 20 years ago, we couldn't have women on our boards of management. And then we couldn't have them in our honorary offices. And then we couldn't have them as chairs. And then we couldn't have them as trustees of the United Synagogue. It'll be rabbis. Right? It'll be rabbis. This is the glacially slow movement of Orthodox Judaism. Orthodox Judaism loves the illusion we never change. Nothing changes because we're Orthodox. And this is how it was when Moses came down from Sinai. Except, of course, it wasn't. Because you didn't have bat mitzvah at Sinai. Come to that, you didn't have bar mitzvah at Sinai. So these things do change. And the challenge, of course, is the speed of change. Because you move too fast, you break the chain. You move too slowly, people walk away. Who's getting the speed right? Right? So the women's thing is a live issue. It still exists. Now, bat mitzvah is becoming increasingly participatory on the part of the girls. There are shuls, Orthodox shuls, United Synagogue shuls, in which girls lane, but only amongst women.
Excuse me, I've got to
Right?
go and do
No? Okay, good to see you. Slam the door and you can make a broigus out of it. Okay, all right, thank you for coming. These things are still live and they're still happening, all right? And we have to also play our part to know enough to be able to challenge restricted perspectives and to understand what the restrictions are about so that we can respect those too. Feminism's unfinished business. Any comments or thoughts or whatever? We've got a few minutes, I guess. 3 minutes, 4
That
minutes.
was a fabulous one for me. I like everything about it, and particularly the fact that it is unfinished. And I've seen the change in my lifetime as well. The way things you just described, having women on shul boards and things. So it's moving. Whether you're going to be prove to be as optimistic as you suggested.
Well, the other thing I was going to say was I think the binary is over. I think the idea of two genders is yesterday's story. I think in 50 years' time, maybe Orthodox Jews are still holding the line. And is that right or is that wrong? But I think in society now, the idea that there are only two genders is fragmenting and fraying at an astonishing rate. And I don't think it'll be long before it's gone as a socially normative position. So already, for example, I live in Bristol. at the Bristol Old Vic Theatre, which is older than the Old Vic here. The Bristol Old Vic Theatre, the toilets now have become unisex, and one of them has on the door, there are urinals in this toilet. Right? So women can choose. We're all used, aren't we, to going to public toilets where the sign is up saying this is serviced by male and female operatives, right? We're all of those sensibilities and subtleties of women's space and men's space is breaking down, right? The ladies' guilds is becoming the shul group, all those kinds of things are breaking down. And I think in general society, the binary will be gone in 20 years.
Can I just add one thing before you wanted to speak? I know, David. I used to go to Palm Springs quite a lot, and to the Chabad there.
Right.
And one Shabbos afternoon, I went there it was for Mincha and Ma'ariv, and there was a woman dressed in a big ascot type hat in a corner, and they were doing the Pirkei Avos. They were discussing it. And I thought there's something strange there. Then one of the Satmara people came in, and he almost collapsed on the floor when he saw this. So I spoke to the rabbi afterwards, and I said, "What's happening there?" He said, "Well, he's transvestite." I said, "Well, how do you deal with him?" So I've said to him, "As far as I'm concerned, you have a Jewish neshama. You're entitled to come to shul and to have an aliyah. Just ask one thing of you: be a bit more discreet."
Yeah, well, I mean, that's that's something about suppressing yourself for the benefit of the community, which is a classical position, right? And that individual is taking a modern position. I must be true to myself, and I can't, I can't think about what the community needs. But these things are under pressure, and they're on the move.
There's movement. Yeah.
There was going to be somebody. Yes.
I was interested that you take the question of biological intersex, which is a well-documented phenomenon, and you make it part of the continuum of self-asserted gender. It's just you can't see the difference. Do you think that that's all part of a spectrum, and therefore, as it were...
I'm absolutely not a medical man, and I'm not even vaguely of a scientific bent. So I can't pretend I can't pretend that I have any expert knowledge or anything like that. My instinct is that there is a spectrum. I mean, clearly there are biological distinctions, but I don't think biology tells you everything about people's gendered behaviour. So there's a biological sex. The vast majority of people are born either clearly male, clearly female. As, by the way, we all know, isn't it, just about the first question asked. Nowadays, you don't even have to wait for the birth to ask. But, is it a boy or a girl? You don't even ask, is it healthy, before you ask, is it a boy or a girl, right? It's kind of one of the very first things you want to know. So we have a gender, and in most cases, you can say categorically, it's a boy, it's a girl. But having said that, the sex of the child, the biological sex of the child is defined. But the way in which that child then grows up to do that, to be that, right? And indeed their sexual proclivities, whether they're gay or not gay, whether they're attracted to members of the opposite sex or the same sex, is something which will emerge over time. And it's very much more to do with nurture than to do with nature. Although I think there are natural proclivities as well. So we have already seen the chief rabbi, Ephraim Mervis, write a remarkable document of sympathy towards gay Jews, and urging in Jewish schools and other places suppression of any level of homophobia or bullying or unpleasantness towards them. And he produced that as his publication on Rosh Hashanah, for Rosh Hashanah, 4 or 5 years ago. I mean, of all the things the chief rabbi would choose to publish at Rosh Hashanah, you might have thought some message to the people, but he publishes this publication using the language of Keshet UK, the LGBTQ plus organisation, right? Using their kind of language, not standing at a distance and going, I'm not talking about that. Now, this is a remarkable development, unthinkable, even under the former Chief Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, who wouldn't have dared to do it. right? He would have been terrified that he'd be shot down by the forces of the right wing, but Ephraim Mervis produced it, right? So there's stuff on the move around gay Jews. It's unthinkable 20, 30 years ago. And yet it's a live issue now. How do we accommodate gay Jews, let alone transvestite Jews? How do we accommodate gay Jews? If there's a man comes and he comes with his husband and sits next to his husband, right? Do we call him up? Do we not call him up? Do we call them both up, one after the other? Are you allowed to do that? Right? There's nothing in halakha about whether you can call up a married spouse one after the other, right? So we haven't got that yet. These things are live and they're hot. I suspect there's a spectrum. I suspect that there's a good proportion of people who are indisputably heterosexual. There's men who fancy women, women who fancy men, and it's, kind of, they can't see what the problem is. And then there's a bunch of folk somewhere in the middle who are blending across, right? And we hear about bisexuals and so on and so forth. I think that the Torah law, which says that a man who lies with another man as with a woman is a toiva. And by the way, the translation of toiva is very interesting. If you think that homosexuality is abominable, then you'll translate toiva as an abomination, right? But if you don't think it's abominable, then you won't translate it as an abomination because the word's only used in that kind of context. I like the fact that toiva sounds an awful lot like taboo, right? That a man who lies with another man as with a woman is taboo, which is not quite as strong as an abomination, is it? But notice this. And we're supposed to take every word of Torah seriously, aren't we? Right? So it says, a man who lies with another man as with a woman is an abomination. A man who lies with an animal is an abomination, or a toiva. Notice, the man lying with another man is qualified, as with a woman. It doesn't say a man who lies with an animal as with a woman. It doesn't say that. It says a man who lies with an animal is a toiva. That sounds absolute, doesn't it? A man who lies with another man as with a woman doesn't sound absolute, it sounds qualified. I think that's talking about heterosexual men playing at homosexuality. That's my reading. That's the gospel according to Clive. You don't have to take it. Right? But otherwise, what is that phrase doing then? If you lie with women, don't lie with men. I don't think the Torah says anything about pure homosexual men. I don't think it talks about that. Right? I think it's talking about the understandable common behaviour of men when they can't lie with women to lie with men. We know about that in the Navy and the prisons and all that sort of stuff. Right? That's what it's talking about. Don't play in this game. But if you've got somebody who is incontrovertibly homosexual, that's a different thing. That line doesn't apply there. Because he's not lying with women. He's lying only with men. But that's my reading. That reading is starting to get a little bit of purchase in amongst Orthodox rabbis. There's a bit of discussion about my reading. There's another out and proud Orthodox gay rabbi, a chap called Steve Greenberg, who lives with his male partner, but they say they do not engage with penetrative sex. Why not? Because it says in the Torah, you shouldn't lie with a man as with a woman. So they don't do that. So he says, this is perfectly acceptable. Some people accept it, some people don't. The issue is live and on the move. Right? I think it's quite an exciting time to be a Jew. That's it. Oh, I'm not.
Yes. Interesting illustration of your dichotomy between men being responsible for the community and women for the family. 1492, Spain. No community.
Yeah.
I know a Jewish man married to a woman from a long-standing Catholic Spanish family. And when she went to his home after they got married, and his mother lit the candles Friday night, she said, but my grandmother used to do that.
Mm. Yes, there's a lot of stories like that, aren't there? The thing that survives is the woman's behaviour.
the home.
Yeah, they're not all wrapping black leather around themselves going, I don't know why, but my grandfather did it. They don't do that. Right. It's quite kinky when you stop and think about it. Yes?
I just wanted to say about the binary, that you said that in 20 years,
Speak up a little bit.
probably we won't have any more this binary world.
Yes.
I actually think that there is a lot of resistance to it, and I think that also for the traditional roles, or for women, I think that there is a group actually in the States, and there is an author to talk about the submissive woman, and it was in the recent years. So I think that things are actually going, in 20 years' time, they may go full circle.
Yeah, look, I mean, things do reverse or complete a circle, and you get back to a more classical position. That's possible as well. Certainly, nothing social goes in a straight line, does it? It bumps and curves. And you may be right. Of course, there are fundamental biological drives that maintain a certain common level of the binary. The vast majority of people are heterosexual and attracted to the opposite sex, and that's how it'll continue to work. What I think I'm talking about more is the social norm that presupposes that everybody's one or the other, which has existed in our own childhoods. That was obvious when we were at school. Didn't boys line up here and girls lined up there? It was all straightforward, right? Nowadays, schools are getting a bit uneasy about that. Right? School uniform, which said girls wear this and boys wear that. It's not quite so easy, right? So these things are fragmenting. They're less confident about making those statements. But of course, there's masses that will continue men to be men and women to be women, and to expect to interact in the ways we always have. But society might stop using this language. That's my thought. Yeah, Mike.
Clive, you talked about, or you opposed, the concept of modernity to the classic. In other words, the individual to the group. I wonder if you could explain that, because there seemed to be a contradiction in what you were saying. If you believe, so are you in favor of the classical or the modern?
Oh, I'm in favour of both. I'm along with Boris Johnson here. I'm in favour of the cake and eating it.
You're bisexual then, right?
No, I think, as with nearly everything, and this is a classical Jewish position, right? We don't do either or, Jews. We do both and. Right? We're always trying to keep both things in play, because the world is nearly always in some kind of tense balance.
But when you're talking about something like intersexuality or LGBTQ, whatever it is, are you talking about individual people, or are you talking about a group? Because it's a fundamental distinction. And if you put everybody in a group like that, you're denying individualism, and you're denying agency to an extent.
Each individual, I would say, and I'm not saying anything remarkable in today's society, each individual obviously has the right and the responsibility to define themselves. I'm sure of that. Right? I don't think you can deny them that right, to say what they think they are.
That's not the point, though.
Whether or not society has to accept what they say is a much more complex territory.
The complex issue is whether you believe in group rights or individual rights, because that leads to fundamental different approaches to law, to cultural mores, to social mores.
Yeah.
And if you believe in social rights, that leads you, in my mind, to a dictatorial, fascist, authoritarian society where you are denying the individual's rights.
So hearing your
quite
accent,
complex.
Right? Your origins are?
I was born in Bedford.
Okay, but you've got a bit of an accent there.
Very difficult.
Come on, tell us.
Yeah, I'm Canadian.
Right. Okay. So North America, the United States most, but Canada as well, is deeply wedded to the idea of the individual. I think that's especially the United States, but I think Canada also is much influenced by this. The idea of the individual, much more than classical European societies, which are older in their mode and move much more slowly on these matters. So I'm not surprised that you think that it would lead to dictatorial and totalitarian approaches to go for the collective, because the privileging of the individual is intense in North America.
Although intersectionality, Black Lives Matter,
Yeah, and
that
this
has
is
come
the
out of the States.
and why?
Which is interesting.
And why? Because
It's a
the
reaction.
privileging, exactly,
Sure,
the privileging of the individual, right, disables society.
Well, I would disagree with that.
Well, I know you would.
Yes.
Right.
Right.
But I would say that it disables society, that it use Velcro. That it disables society.
I use a hair clip.
Yeah,
It's
no,
not-
Velcro.
What can I say?
Nailing it on is painful.
Super
Velcro
glue.
does it.
Super glue
Yeah,
does
super
it.
glue.
Yeah. Sorry.
But using, yeah, that's good. You see, now we know that gender balance is what we need.
Absolutely.
Right.
She's helping me keep my head screwed on. You know, what can I say?
It's the balance always. It's the both and. It's keeping both in play. And that is very unsatisfactory to the Western mind, especially to the Western modern mind. Right? And we know that Aristotle says in his logic that things are either alpha or not alpha. That's the binary. Right? And we know that modern computers are built on binary. That's how you do it. Except they realise they have to do fuzzy logic.
Not a quantum computer and all the rest.
Because
of it.
it's exactly,
Yeah,
because it's too simplistic. Society is more complicated than that. Human beings don't do binary, right? When you read the Encyclopedia Britannica, it's alphabetical order. It's all very Greek. It all makes sense, right? That's how you do it. Right? When you read the Talmud, it's not alphabetical order, it's all associative. It's, that reminds me of something, and by the way, and here we are. And try getting Jews to follow a conversation, right? It just doesn't work. Because we do this thing humanly. And your dilemma, or the dilemma you express, it's either one thing or the other, makes absolutely excellent sense when trying to organise a society. One or the other, let's be clear. But of course, the beauty of European societies is that they are old and complicated, which means to say that they hardly ever come down on one side or the other, right? North American cities are all on grids, right? European cities are all swerving around the church that was there already, and Farmer Giles's field needs the thing and the tree, and you can't take that down and stuff. And as a result, we can't ever drive in a straight line here, right? But there's something rather human about that. I don't want to make a great virtue out of it because it's also very sloppy. So I want to keep the tension. Now that is why I am tremendously pleased that I'm not responsible for anything, right? So when I go in non-Jewish, all of you know already, but when I go in non-Jewish circles, they sometimes think I'm a rabbi, right? And I always say it's to the great good fortune of both the Jews and me that I'm not a rabbi, right? I don't want any of that responsibility. But I do love the idea of keeping all these things in play. So I'm not going to answer your question.
Fine. No problem.
Like to. Thank you very much.
Clive, this is a great opportunity for me to say how I really feel, and very rarely at a meeting like this am I able to be truthful, entirely truthful. But tonight I can be, because you have given us a fantastic series of thoughts and stimuli which we're going to take away and chew over for some time, I should imagine. And the reason is because you exemplify what you've just been saying. You're a human person, exemplifying humanity, but also you have a foot in so many expert camps, and this has been very apparent from your speech tonight. Whether it's a lecture or a debate or something else, I really don't mind, but it's been terrific. So I think we're all going to say thank you very much and come back soon.
Thank you very much. Folks, I don't know what Perry may or may not say at the end of this, but I want to say to you, this evening is part of an experimental dynamic for the community to see what will work for folk and what might bring folk. And there was a moment's panic a few days ago that the audience was going to be quite small. And how did I feel about that? And, can we bring you all this way for a small audience? I said Sodom and Gomorrah would have been saved for 10 people, and you've got more than 10. So as far as I'm concerned, that's good enough for the new West End.
Are you playing something there, Clive?
But what I would say is this, folks. As you heard, I'm coming another couple of times, the next time in December sometime. It would be grand if you could put the word out amongst folk. You now know what sort of thing I do, so hopefully you're not going to say it was dreadful, I'm not coming either. But if you can bring along, each of you, bring along a couple of mates, that would be even better. So do think about that. I think the ambition of the community is lovely, and it deserves your support and your participation. And they can't bring everybody, but you might bring a couple more folk. Even if it requires you coughing up a tenner on their behalf or something. And if you've got a son or a daughter or a grandson or a granddaughter or a neighbour or a friend or an acquaintance, whatever, bring them along to the next session, because that'll be grand. But if it's just you, I'm still prepared to come, because you're a lovely audience. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, Clive.
Now, nobody's going home until you've eaten all of it.
That's right, including you. Go and help us. Now you're going to go do it.
Yeah.